Imagine waking up in Paris, the city of lights, only to find the streets empty, the bakeries closed, and the metro silent. Where did everyone go? They didn't flee a war. They didn't run from a plague. They ran towards a glitch, a digital error that priced a business class ticket to Manila at the price of a single croissant. In the next hour, 50,000 Parisians, tired of the rain, the strikes, and the gray skies, stormed Charles de Gaulle Airport in a desperate exodus that would bring the Philippine capital to its knees. This is the story of the Great Manila Migration, a day that turned Ninoy Aquino International Airport into a refugee camp for the fashion-conscious and turned the streets of Makati into a surreal extension of the Champs-Élysées. Before we dive into the chaos, tell me where you are watching from. Are you stuck in the cold or enjoying the tropics? Drop your city and country in the comments below. I love seeing how global this community is. Now let's witness the day Paris moved to the Philippines. It started at 3:14 a.m. Paris time. A server farm in Frankfurt hiccuped. A line of code in the global reservation system fractured, and for exactly 45 minutes, every single flight from Paris to Manila, on every major airline, was listed for €1. Not 1,000, not 100. 1. The link hit a student forum first, then Reddit, and then it exploded onto TikTok like a digital wildfire. By the time the airlines realized the catastrophic error, 50,000 tickets had been issued. Under international aviation laws and a panic-induced PR decision to avoid a riot, the airlines decided to honor the tickets. They didn't realize they weren't just honoring a discount. They were inviting an invasion. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 11th arrondissement, Jacques, a burnt-out Michelin star sous chef, stared at his phone. He had just bought a ticket. He packed his knives, left his keys on the counter, and walked out the door. He wasn't alone. Across the city, thousands of others were doing the exact same thing. By 6 a.m., the périphérique, the ring road surrounding Paris, was gridlocked, but not with the usual morning commuters. It was jammed with taxis, Ubers, and private cars all heading in one direction, Charles de Gaulle Airport. The mood wasn't angry, it was manic. It was the energy of a city that had been given a sudden, unexpected escape hatch. People were abandoning cars on the shoulder and walking the final kilometers with suitcases rolling over the asphalt like the rumble of approaching thunder. The airport authorities were blindsided. They had staffed for a Tuesday in November, not the evacuation of Dunkirk. Inside Terminal 2E, the air conditioning struggled to cope with the body heat of a mob that swelled by the minute. There were no lines, only a swaying mass of humanity clutching printed boarding passes like golden tickets. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the sharp tang of anxiety sweat. The destination board flickered, row after row changing to Manila, on time, as airlines scrambled to pull spare aircraft from hangars to meet the impossible demand. Jacques managed to squeeze onto the third flight out, a retrofitted A380 that was packed to the rafters. The atmosphere on board was surreal. Strangers were sharing wine they had bought from duty-free, passing bottles across the aisles. There was a hysterical, laughing energy, the kind you feel when you've gotten away with something massive. But beneath the laughter, there was a sense of collective desperation. These weren't just tourists, they were escapees. Paris had been grueling that year, relentless rain, political unrest, economic stagnation. The €1 ticket wasn't just a travel deal. It was a permission slip to run away. As the plane taxied, Jacques looked out the window. He saw another plane landing, and another behind it. The sky over Paris was a conga line of heavy metal, all pointed southeast. He closed his eyes, imagining palm trees and sun, completely unaware that they were heading into a logistical nightmare that would make the chaos in Paris look like a well-organized dinner party. They were 50,000 people heading to a city that didn't know they were coming. 13 hours later, the first wave hit Manila. Ninoy Aquino International Airport, NAIA, is infamous for its congestion on a normal day. Today, it was about to face an apocalypse. The radar screen in the control tower looked like a solid block of green light. Flights were stacking up and holding patterns that stretched all the way to Hong Kong. On the ground, the heat was the first thing that hit the Parisians. Stepping off the plane, Jacques felt the humidity wrap around him like a wet, hot towel. It was 34 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity. The Parisians, dressed in trench coats, scarves, and boots, began to wilt immediately. The immigration hall was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The queues snaked out of the hall, down the corridors, and back onto the jet bridges. The air conditioning units at NAIA groaned, and then, tragically, 2 of the main chillers failed. The temperature inside the terminal spiked. Tempers, already frayed by the long flight and the alcohol, began to snap. The immigration officers, bless their hearts, were heroes in a losing battle. They were stamping passports with a rhythmic, frantic speed, but for every one person they cleared, 5 more planes landed. The system crashed twice. Rumors started spreading through the crowd that they would be turned back, that there wasn't enough food in the city, that this was all a scam. Jacques found himself pressed against a glass partition, watching the chaos unfold. He saw a woman in a Chanel suit sitting on the baggage carousel, weeping silently. He saw a group of students trying to organize a protest chant that nobody understood. The Filipino hospitality staff, usually smiling and composed, looked terrified. They were handing out bottles of water, but the supplies were running out. This was the ticket chaos the news channels were screaming about. CNN had cut into regular programming. The headline read, "The French Invasion of Manila." It wasn't a war, but it felt like a siege. By the time Jacques cleared immigration, it was dark. He stepped out of the terminal expecting to find a taxi. Instead, he found a sea of people. The arrival curbside was a mosh pit. The Grab app, the local equivalent of Uber, was showing a wait time of 480 minutes and a surge price that cost more than his flight. The taxi queues wrapped around the building 3 times. The entire transport infrastructure of Metro Manila had paralyzed under the sudden load. Buses were full before they even reached the stops. Jeepneys, the iconic Filipino minibuses, were jammed with luggage strapped to roofs, hanging off the back bars and sitting on laps. Jacques, desperate and exhausted, did the only thing he could do. He started walking. He walked away from the airport, dragging his Rimowa suitcase over the uneven pavement of Pasay City, surrounded by thousands of other confused, sweating French nationals who looked like they had crash-landed on an alien planet. The spillover into the city was instantaneous and bizarre. Metro Manila is a dense, frenetic urban sprawl, totally unlike the wide boulevards of Paris. The Parisians wandered into the barangays, neighborhoods, surrounding the airport. Local sari-sari stores, small convenience shops, were suddenly besieged by tall, confused Europeans asking for eau mineral and croissants. The shopkeepers, bewildered but enterprising, sold them warm Coke and Skyflakes crackers. The culture shock was violent. The noise of the tricycles, the smell of diesel and street food, the tangled wires overhead, it was sensory overload. Jacques found himself sitting on a plastic stool at a roadside eatery, staring at a pot of adobo. The owner, a formidable woman named Tita Baby, didn't speak French, and Jacques didn't speak Tagalog or English. They communicated through the universal language of food. She ladled a bowl of pork stew over rice and shoved it at him. He took a bite. It was salty, sour, fatty, and delicious. For the first time in 24 hours, he smiled. As the night deepened, the accommodation crisis hit. Every hotel in Pasay, Makati, and BGC was fully booked within an hour of the first landing. The overflow spilled into motels, hostels, and eventually, the kindness of strangers. The viral nature of the event had alerted the locals. Filipinos, known for their extreme hospitality, started opening their doors. It began on Facebook. "I have a spare room in Parañaque, sofa available in Mandaluyong." It was a chaotic, organic humanitarian effort. Jacques, unable to find a hotel, was beckoned by Tita Baby. She gestured to the room behind her eatery. It was cramped, hot, and smelled of garlic, but it had a bed. He collapsed onto it, listening to the sounds of the city, the roosters that seemingly crowed at all hours, the distant karaoke, the rumble of trucks. He was thousands of miles from his sterile apartment in Le Marais, and strangely, he felt more alive than he had in years. The next morning, the sun rose on a Manila that had been transformed. The French invasion was the only topic of conversation. 50,000 extra people in a city of 14 million might seem statistically small, but they were concentrated. The café culture of Makati collided with the café culture of Paris. French tourists, refusing to be defeated by the lack of sidewalks, simply took over the streets, walking in the middle of the road, forcing the jeepneys to crawl. They were looking for coffee. Not the sweet, instant coffee popular locally, but coffee. The Starbucks lines were 3 hours long. Enterprising locals set up makeshift pour-over stations on the sidewalks, selling Barako coffee, a strong, local bean, to the desperate Europeans. Jacques woke up and immediately went to the kitchen. He couldn't help himself. He saw Tita Baby struggling with the morning rush. He tied on an apron. The fusion of French technique and Filipino ingredients was about to begin in a tiny carinderia in Pasay. By midday, the traffic situation, usually a nightmare, had transcended into a metaphysical state of immobility. EDSA, the main highway, was a parking lot. But something strange was happening. The Parisians, accustomed to protesting, began to treat the traffic jam as a social event. They got out of their cars and buses. They started smoking on the median strips. They shared food with the drivers. A strange camaraderie formed between the stressed Filipino commuters and the bewildered French tourists. Street vendors made a killing selling cut mangoes and water. The chaos that the news predicted was turning into a weird, massive street party. The local government, fearing riots, had deployed police, but there was no violence. Just confusion and a lot of Gallic shrugging. The mayor of Manila appeared on TV, looking exhausted, and declared a state of calamity, but then jokingly welcomed the new residents. Jacques, meanwhile, was revolutionizing Tita Baby's menu. He found calamansi, local lime, and used it to make a curd for a tart. He used local tablia chocolate to make a mousse. The smell wafted out into the street. A few French tourists, lost and hungry, followed their noses. Then a few locals. By lunch, there was a line. It became a microcosm of the citywide phenomenon. In the high-end districts, French chefs who had fled Paris were walking into Manila kitchens and asking for jobs. In the malls, French fashionistas were raiding the department stores because they had packed for a weekend, not a migration, and they were melting in their winter clothes. The smock dress and sinilas, flip-flops, became the new high fashion. You saw women in Balenciaga walking in rubber slippers because their heels kept getting stuck in the pavement cracks. The clash of social norms was hilarious and jarring. The French, famous for their directness and complaining, met the Filipinos, famous for their pakikasama, smooth interpersonal relations, and conflict avoidance. In restaurants, French diners would loudly critique the service or the food, causing the Filipino waitstaff to giggle nervously or hide in the kitchen. But slowly, a middle ground was found. The Filipinos taught the French how to chill. That rushing was futile in Manila traffic. The French taught the Filipinos that it was okay to demand better wine. The friction generated heat, but also light. Video clips went viral. A French man trying to ride a crowded MRT train and being shoved in by the pushers, laughing hysterically. A group of Parisian women learning to eat ballet, fertilized duck egg, and screaming in a mix of horror and delight. The economic impact was instant and volatile. The peso fluctuated. The price of bread skyrocketed as every bakery in the city sold out by 8 a.m. But the injection of euro cash into the local economy was massive. Tricycle drivers were being paid in euros because the money changers had run out of pesos. You'd see a tricycle driver holding a 20-euro note, looking at it like it was a winning lottery ticket. The black market for accommodation exploded. People were renting out their driveways for tents. The city was bursting at the seams, but it held. It held because Manila is a city designed to absorb shocks. It absorbs typhoons, earthquakes, and political upheavals. A few thousand confused Europeans were just another Tuesday, albeit a very weird one. On the third day, the reality set in. The airlines announced it would take weeks to repatriate everyone. Most of the 50,000 didn't have return tickets. They had bought one-ways in the heat of the moment. They were stuck. The vacation was now a residency. This is where the story shifted from chaos to connection. Jacques sat with Tita Baby, peeling garlic. They didn't speak much, but they understood each other. He learned about her life, her husband working overseas in Dubai, her kids in the province. He realized his burnout in Paris was a luxury. Her grind was survival. It humbled him. He stopped thinking about when he would leave and started thinking about what he could do while he was here. He went to the local market, the Palenque, and was blown away by the produce, the seafood, the fruits, the chaos of the wet market. It was visceral and real, unlike the sanitized supermarkets of Europe. The tourists who had rushed to the beaches of Boracay and Palawan were having a different experience. The islands were sinking under the weight. The pristine beaches were crowded with pale bodies turning lobster red in the tropical sun. But even there, the magic of the Philippines was working. The island time mentality forced the high-strung Parisians to slow down. You can't scream at a boat captain to go faster when the tide is out. You just wait. And in the waiting, they started to talk to each other and to the locals. The aggressive individualism of the West melted slightly in the communal heat of the tropics. They sat in circles on the sand, drinking Red Horse beer, watching the sunset, realizing that the stress they ran away from was largely self-imposed. Back in Manila, the Little Paris phenomenon was growing. The walled city of Intramuros, with its Spanish colonial architecture, became a magnet. The French felt a strange familiarity there, the cobblestones, the old churches. They gathered there in the evenings, playing music, drinking, turning the historic district into a massive open-air salon. The Filipino students joined them. Guitars appeared. A cultural exchange that usually takes decades was happening in days. They sang Edith Piaf. The locals sang Eraserheads. It was a cacophony, a mess, but a beautiful one. The police watched from a distance, realizing that as long as there was food and music, there would be no riots. However, not everything was romantic. The strain on resources was real. Water shortages hit certain districts. The garbage collection system collapsed under the extra load. Tensions flared in queues. There were fistfights over taxis. The romantic escape was fraying at the edges. The heat was relentless. Prickly heat rash became an epidemic among the French. Dengue fever cases ticked up. The reality of a developing nation was slapping them in the face. It wasn't just a cheap paradise, it was a hard, gritty place to live. Some of the tourists broke down, demanding their embassies evacuate them. The French embassy in Makati was besieged, looking more like a fortress under attack than a diplomatic mission. Jacques, amidst the growing tension, found his anchor. He had taken over the kitchen of the Carinderia completely. Tita Baby was now the front of house, charming the customers while Jacques sweated over the woks. He created a dish that became the symbol of the event, adobo bourguignon. It was pork adobo slow-cooked with red wine and bay leaves, served with garlic rice. It was rich, dark, and confusing, just like the situation. Food vloggers descended. The queue for his humble stall now wrapped around the block. He was famous, not for a Michelin star, but for feeding the displaced masses. He realized he was happier sweating in this tin-roofed kitchen than he had ever been in his pristine stainless steel lab in Paris. As the first week ended, the repatriation flights began. Giant A380s from Air France, Lufthansa, and Emirates began landing in waves to take the refugees home. The departure hall at NAIA was scenes of tearful goodbyes. But here was the twist. Many didn't want to go. The airlines reported a 20% no-show rate for the return flights. People were tearing up their tickets. They were extending their visas. They had fallen in love, not just with the place, but with the feeling of being alive. In Paris, everything was regulated, predictable, gray. Here, everything was a negotiation, a surprise, a burst of color. They chose the chaos. The no-shows created a new demographic in Manila, the lost Parisians. They moved into condos, they started businesses, they became English and French tutors. They infiltrated the creative industries. The art scene in Manila exploded with a new, weird energy. The nightlife in Poblacion became legendary, a mix of gritty Manila street vibes and Parisian hedonism. It was a golden age of cultural fusion, born from a computer glitch. The Philippine government, seeing the opportunity, created a special friendship visa to regularize their stay, realizing that these crazy French people were actually stimulating the economy. Jacques was one of the no-shows. He called his old head chef in Paris and quit over the phone. "I'm not coming back," he said. "I'm cooking rice now." Tita baby and he became partners. They expanded the carinderia into a proper bistro, but kept the plastic stools. It was called the Glitch. It became the most impossible-to-book restaurant in Asia. The menu was written on cardboard in marker pen. The food was spectacular. Jacques had found his soul in the chaos. The impact on Paris was equally profound. The city felt empty for weeks. The silence forced the remaining Parisians to look at their city differently. The Great Exodus became a wake-up call for the French government. Why were so many people so desperate to leave? It sparked a national conversation about quality of life, about burnout, about the need for joy. The 50,000 who left had sent back stories and videos that painted the Philippines not as a third-world charity case, but as a place of vibrant, messy humanity that Europe had lost. As the months passed, the storming of Manila entered the history books. It was studied by sociologists and economists. It was the first viral migration. It proved that in a hyper-connected world, populations are fluid. A single digital spark can move armies of tourists. But for the people on the ground, it wasn't a study, it was a memory. The jeepney drivers still tell stories of the day the white giants came and couldn't fit in the seats. The street vendors still laugh about the Frenchman who tried to eat raw mango with the skin on. The friendship visa holders, the ones who stayed, changed the fabric of the city. You'd walk through a market in Divisoria and hear fluent Tagalog spoken with a thick French accent. You'd see bakeries selling pandesalo chocolate. The two cultures, seemingly opposites, found they shared a deep love for food, for family, and for sitting around a table for hours talking about nothing and everything. The Catholicism of both nations provided a strange, underlying bridge. They understood the rhythm of the church bells and the fiestas. But the chaos had left scars too. The infrastructure of Manila was battered. The airport had to undergo emergency renovations. The debate about over-tourism and gentrification raged. Rents in certain areas had spiked, pushing locals out. It wasn't a fairy tale ending for everyone. It forced the Philippine government to finally get serious about upgrading public transport, shamed by the international spotlight on their gridlocked roads. In a way, the invasion forced the city to grow up, to modernize, to prepare for a world where it was no longer a hidden gem. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the Glitch, a festival was held. They closed down Roxas Boulevard. It was called Paris-Manila Day. There were parades. There were baguettes and lechon. Jacques stood in the crowd, holding Tita Baby's hand. He looked at the sunset over Manila Bay, the famous, fiery sunset that no camera can truly capture. He thought about the rain in Paris. He missed the cheese, sure. But he didn't miss the cold. He looked around at the faces, Filipino, French, and everything in between, laughing, eating, sweating. The story of the 50,000 wasn't just about a ticket. It was about a collective yearning for something different. We live in bubbles, curated by algorithms and comfort. We think we know what we want: safety, predictability. But when the door opened, when the glitch happened, 50,000 people chose the unknown. They chose the humidity and the noise. They chose to be uncomfortable, and in doing so, they found themselves. It was a testament to the human spirit's desire for adventure, for the raw friction of real life. The legacy of that day is visible in the small details. It's in the way Manila service staff now speak a little French. It's in the way Parisian cafes now serve calamansi juice. It proved that borders are just lines on a map, but culture is a living, breathing thing that flows like water. When the dam breaks, it doesn't destroy, it irrigates. It creates something new. The Philippines, often overlooked by the Eurocentric world, had shown it could absorb, adapt, and eventually charm an entire army of cynics. Jacques often wonders if it will happen again. Sometimes, late at night, he checks the airline apps, looking for another glitch. Not to leave, but to see who else might come. He knows the world is full of tired people waiting for a sign. A €1 ticket. A reason to run. He hopes they find their Manila, their chaos, their Tita baby. He hopes they find the courage to click buy and deal with the consequences later. So, was the Philippines ready for 50,000 Frenchmen? Absolutely not. Was it a disaster? Logistically, yes. But was it real? It was the realest thing that ever happened to them. It tore down the postcard image and replaced it with a gritty, sweaty, beautiful reality. And for the 50,000 who stormed the gates of paradise, they learned that paradise isn't a place with perfect service and white sand. Paradise is a place where you are forced to wake up. Thanks for watching this documentary on the day the world tilted. If you enjoyed this story of chaos and croissants, hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments, if you saw a $1 ticket to the other side of the world tonight, would you take it? Until next time, safe travels.